Welcome to the Center Collaborative, Creative Solutions in Behavioral Health and Criminal Justice, brought to you by the Oregon Center on Behavioral Health and Justice Integration, which is also known as the Center. We at the Center are all about solutions. Our job in Oregon is to facilitate improvement of the system so behavioral health and criminal justice can work better together to engage people in treatment while promoting public safety. I am your host, Chris Thomas. I hold a master's degree in clinical psychology and have focused on the intersection between behavioral health and criminal justice for 20 years. Over 7 of those years were behind the walls of a maximum security prison. During this podcast, you will have the opportunity to sit in on real, in-depth conversations with experts about complex topics in a way that is both fascinating and digestible. We will focus not just on what is wrong with the system, but what is going right and how we can work together to evolve. This podcast is a conversation in a series of conversations where we touch on people's legal rights and their options related to seeking medical care. Since our conversations are intended for informational and educational purposes only, they are not a substitute for or a reason to delay seeking professional legal or medical advice. On today's podcast, I am joined by Dr. Andrew Orff, partner of Lithia Forensic and Consulting, LCC, and a Certified Forensic Evaluator. We talk about what a Certified Forensic Evaluator is and what they do. And most importantly, we address myths, as well as the complexity around evaluations and the need for a nuanced process. I learned so much during my conversation with Dr. Orff. I think you will too. Welcome to our conversation. Today on the podcast, we have with us Dr. Andrew Orff, PsyD. Andrew and I know each other pretty well. He's asked me to call him Andrew throughout the podcast, so I will be calling him Andrew instead of Dr. Orff today. He is a partner of Lithia Forensic and Consulting, LLC, and a Certified Forensic Evaluator. So welcome, Andrew. It's fantastic to have you on the podcast today.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of misinformation around what certified forensic evaluators do. So could we start off with talking about what is a certified forensic evaluator?
In the state of Oregon, I believe it was around 2012, the state started this process of creating certification for certified forensic evaluators. And since that time, it's grown to now what that process looks like is that you have to submit your credentials to a state board that reviews those credentials, and then you participate in an initial training where you submit forensic evaluations to a board that reviews them. After that, you get a credential of being able to call yourself a certified forensic evaluator.
So as a certified forensic evaluator, what does that work look like? What do CFEs do?
So by the Oregon Administrative Rules statute, the primary area that they talk about with those is fitness to proceed evaluations and evaluations of criminal responsibility, which Oregon is guilty except for insanity. I don't believe that forensic certification is required for other types of evaluations, but it's generally a stamp of this person has a specific training in forensics and they know what they're doing in this larger domain. So even though it's not required for other types of evaluations, typically it's preferred when doing other types of evaluations or work.
Particularly with the court.
Yeah, particularly with legal involvement. So that can be a lot of different things. I know that even in the non-criminal area, which certified forensic evaluators don't apply with, I'm typically asked about forensic certification because it's related to it, because it's a different approach of how you conduct evaluations.
And for our listening audience, just to clarify, fitness to proceed, aid and assist, competency, we're all talking about the same thing, it's just different lingo that we end up using. And that is if someone is facing criminal charges, if they are competent at that time. Guilty except for insanity is if someone had symptomology at the time of the crime. So there are two different periods of time that I think people get confused sometimes. Am I accurate in that? Do you want to clarify any of that for the listening audience?
Like you said, it's called a number of different things. Evaluators typically use those terms interchangeably. I think a lot of it is where people were trained fitness to proceed, aid and assist, competency to stand trial. Those are all different terms that are used that all mean the same thing. And all of those issues are typically brought up what we call in the pre-adjudication stage before a legal finding of guilty, not guilty. Typically, those issues of fitness to proceed and aid and assist issues get brought up at some point between time of arrest or indictment and the trial process. Sometimes those issues get brought up in the middle of trial. Sometimes those issues get brought up even before charges are filed. And then guilty except for insanity, criminal responsibility, mental state at the time of the offense, all those are interchangeable as well in a large sense. And all those are focused on what was occurring around the time of the allegations. I think a lot of times people misconceive that if somebody's unable to aid and assist, or not fit to proceed, or not competent to stand trial, it means that they're going to be guilty except for insanity. And then vice versa. There's people that are found guilty except for insanity that are never found unable to aid and assist or not fit to proceed.
So there are two discrete periods that could or could not be mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
Someone could have both. They could have one. They could have the other going on. And we shouldn't assume that both are going to be routine in all cases.
Correct. They're really different processes. A lot of times there are overlaps with them where you'll see somebody for fitness to proceed and see them down the line for guilty except for insanity, but that isn't always the case.
I think that's helpful because lots of folks confuse the two time periods, and taking some time to explain that you could have one and not the other and vice versa or both, I think is a helpful moment for listeners because it is kind of confusing for folks if it's not your world.
I think it's confusing for folks even if it is your world. I think that there's stuff in the process as an evaluator. You have to keep up on what's going on. And you'll constantly run into new things that you don't know or don't have familiarity with and that you need to reach out. And even attorneys that are representing people full time, there's confusion about that.
So either when you're looking at fitness or GEI, I would imagine that's a fairly complicated process to suss those out. And I'm wondering if you want to talk about that a little bit.
So it is complicated. There is a lot of nuance. It's a combination of statutes, Oregon administrative rules, applicable case law that all play into it. And then there's the front end of what the actual evaluations look like. There's common themes with those, but they're also very context dependent and what the specific evaluation includes and looks at. I think that a lot of times people outside are like, how hard can this be? You go down a checkbox of what's there and what's not. It's very easy, but the evaluations take a lot of time typically. They take a lot of knowledge about all the back end stuff as well as what you're seeing. And it's really a mix of kind of two different areas. One is of law, and then you also have this whole other side, which is the clinical side of it as a psychologist, which is what all of us are trained in generally. And so then it's combining those two things and overlaying them and seeing where things stand with those.
And it requires vast clinical knowledge, too. I think that gets lost sometimes in the conversation. Most folks think about psychiatric diagnoses when they think about competency and GEI, but I know at least in competency, it is not just psychiatric disorders, but also intellectual and developmental disabilities and neurocognitive concerns also fit into those categories. So it's a vast array of knowledge that has to be held both in the legal sense and on the clinical side of things, as well as pieces like how are drugs affecting this. It's a lot to know, put together, and synthesize.
There's what we call psychiatric conditions like psychosis, major mood issues. Like you mentioned, there's neurodevelopmental disorders and neurocognitive disorders. There's also the issue of substance use, which is a common theme and concern in the evaluations. There's the issues of personality traits and disorders that can look very similar to some of those other things. And then there's also cultural factors, which are always present and always need to be considered as well. It requires a lot of teasing out different things and exploring alternative hypotheses for what you're seeing, and then coming to a conclusion that you feel comfortable with. Another major difference between forensic work and clinical work is when you're just doing clinical work, you're providing a service to the person who's sitting in front of you, typically. With forensic evaluations, you're providing work for a larger system, which is typically the retaining party, and also to the court, because at the end of the day, our job as evaluators is to be of assistance to the court.
Yes, so the court can ultimately make the decision of able, not able, or never able. So you're giving a recommendation, but it is the judge that actually makes that determination. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's the judge. And the research says that judges typically agree with evaluators when there's a singular opinion a large amount of the time, but it's not always the case. With GEI evaluations, there are sometimes opposing opinions on things, which is completely normal. In those cases, it's just providing all the information to the courts and the parties as far as what your opinion is as an evaluator.
So it sounds very complicated with a lot of nuance and the need for a lot of professional knowledge, both on the clinical and legal side. And I'm assuming in fairly quick timelines as well.
On the criminal side of things, a large portion of the individuals that we're evaluating are typically in correctional settings. With that, there's always the pressing issue of either wanting the case to be resolved or something to occur within that process, especially with the aid and assist issues when a lot of those individuals are in jails. Typically, jails are not the best place for individuals with serious mental illness or neurodevelopmental disorders or neurocognitive disorders. I think all parties in cases where there is an issue of fitness to proceed and needing to move forward to restoration, getting those individuals out of correctional settings is needed. And then in cases where there is an issue related to fitness to proceed, having those cases move through the legal system in a timely manner. With COVID, for example, the courts have gotten extremely backed up with delays. And there's also the issues of having attorneys in the state to provide representation to those individuals. So there's pressing issues, whichever way that you look at it.
And another piece in my conversations through Oregon, I think sometimes gets confused for folks, is the MINC decision comes into play once someone has been found that they need competency restoration. That's the 7 days from jail to a facility. That decision does not come into play until the competency decision is made. So someone could be in the waiting for an evaluator place much longer than that. Hence the need for readily available evaluators to be able to get to people more quickly so they're not in jail for long periods of time waiting for that initial evaluation to determine competency.
Yeah, what you've seen in Oregon is mimicked pretty similarly across the country. There's not enough evaluators. There's a disconnect between matching referrals for these types of evaluations to evaluators. And what that's created essentially in Oregon, which is similar to other areas in the country, is that there's long waits to get individuals evaluated. That typically is worse in areas where there's less dense populations, such as rural frontier counties, because there aren't the amount of evaluators that are there. The evaluators that are there, there's not the diversity of expertise and areas of interest. And so it creates this essential backlog of getting people evaluated. The time span between we need an evaluation gets scheduled, evaluation gets completed, it's often a long time. And people are looking at how do we shorten that? Going back to what we were talking about previously, if there's a concern about fitness to proceed, it essentially puts the process on hold.
And the last thing you want is someone in jail for a long time, not because there's a knock on jail, but just that jails are not psychiatric facilities and not a great place for a person to be when they're having acute symptomology.
When you talk with jail commanders around the state of Oregon, they readily acknowledge that jail is not the best place for individuals with serious mental illness. They work in corrections. They are not mental health providers. These are not treatment facilities. And then there's the issue in Oregon as far as what the bar is for civil commitment. So you see a lot of people that are acutely mentally ill, but there's really nowhere that they can go or that they can be placed to get help when they need it as quick as they need it.
So it's a pretty big problem in Oregon. I think we've done a good job of laying that out. I also want to talk about the solution that I know that Lithia is involved in around rapid evaluations to help, particularly in rural and frontier counties in Oregon, increase access and quicker evaluations as a way to speed up the process of someone being seen and evaluated so they can move on and the court can make a decision and then MINC comes into play.
I think quick is probably the underlying theme of that. And essentially the evaluation process is similar. I think that you've talked with other evaluators about rapid programs in other parts of the state. They're very similar across county. And essentially the goal is to have quick evaluations that are high quality, that everybody is invested in. It's a collaborative process, typically among parties that are adversarial in the legal system. So it's getting the district attorneys, the defense attorneys, the court, the community mental health providers all together in one space. identifying individuals that need these evaluations, having the evaluations done quickly, and then getting a placement for them if needed. As part of our practice, we do that with rural and frontier counties. A big part of that too is just to be transparent. When you get in rural counties, they don't have the access to evaluators that the Portland metro area does. They're often looking for evaluators that are qualified, that they can trust. They're looking for evaluators that are able to work within the system that they have. And every single county has a different legal system as far as the culture there. And so being able to work within that
is extremely important, and especially having access in rural and frontier counties. What Andrew is alluding to, listeners, and we see this in many professions, there are more psychologists and psychiatrists, certified forensic evaluators in the urban places within the state and not as many in rural and frontier counties. And sometimes that makes it difficult in those counties to have access, particularly in certain times of the year where travel is difficult. And so having evaluators that work specifically with counties is helpful for them because they're known and trusted, and it gives rural and frontier counties more access to certified forensic evaluators by having these programs.
I don't have the exact numbers, but I would imagine that a large majority of the evaluators in the state of Oregon are located in Portland, Salem, Eugene areas. And the fact is when there's counties or areas that have no forensic evaluators locally, those places are looking for how do we meet the needs of the county, because these issues that we're talking about of like fitness to proceed, it's not a Portland, Salem, Eugene problem. It's a statewide problem. Those things have to be addressed at some way, shape, or form by the larger community as a whole.
Right. It's not like they cease to exist in other areas of the state, and resources need to be available regardless of where the problem exists.
Yeah, exactly.
I know we want to talk about what other things certified forensic evaluators do. There's so much more to your job and what you do. I'm wondering, before we move there, is there anything that you want to touch on before we talk about what other pieces of work certified forensic evaluators do?
We could probably spend hours talking about the ins and outs of evaluations. I think that especially over the past couple of years that the aid and assist issues in the state of Oregon have become a major theme. And it's kind of the larger issue regarding how we treat individuals with mental illness and that intersection of the law. I think there's a lack of solutions, and I'm not sure there is a great solution with it. The ins and out of forensic evaluations is very complex. I'm not sure that there's an easier way to put that, and how those issues interact throughout the legal system and through the larger communities in the state.
I'm wondering, of course, shielding details to protect confidentiality. I'm wondering if you have an example that could put a face and a story to the complexity and how important certified forensic evaluators are in this process.
This isn't about one specific person, but I know that there are plenty of people that we evaluate that get involved with the legal system that we see on the forensic side because there have been repeated failures in getting these people treatment in any other way. I think that there's an acknowledgement across the state that the legal system has turned into the de facto mental health system. There's multiple barriers up of getting access to treatment with providers. I think that it's been an issue for 30 years in this country where we have an insufficient amount of psychiatric prescribers. We don't have enough hospital beds, and then people have contact with law enforcement. And I think that a lot of individuals that we end up evaluating get charged with misdemeanor offenses because essentially there's no other option of how to get treatment for these individuals. If they don't want that treatment, they don't meet criteria for civil commitment. And there's people that we evaluate on high-level felony offenses where there's very good basis for the specific issues with the legal system. But there are a lot of individuals that we're evaluating on misdemeanor crimes where we talk with people behind the scenes about that, whether it's defense attorneys, prosecutors, and it's essentially, what do we do in this case? Because we've tried everything else, and whatever else we've tried just isn't working. Forensic work is very unique because it's not specific clinical work, but the flip side of that is a lot of times we're seeing people in a forensic context that everybody else involved in the case is just looking to have that person get whatever they need to move forward and not have the recurrent legal involvement.
So for the misdemeanors that you're talking about, I'm assuming you're talking about non-person misdemeanors. This person's coming to the attention of law enforcement over and over and over again, and the traditional system is not working for whatever reason, access, engagement. And by going through this path, there is the belief and the hope that engagement will occur. Is that a good summary of that?
Yeah, that's a good summary. And now there's this whole new issue with the federal court orders. And I don't think that we've seen yet how that's going to fully transpire, having misdemeanor defendants for 90 days at the state hospital, what that looks like in the larger effect. But yeah, I think that a lot of times there's individuals that we evaluate that it becomes as much of a clinical what do we do in this situation as it does related to can the person understand the charges against them, understand the legal system, can they work with their attorney? It's much less focused on that from the larger systems perspective and much more focused on what next.
I'm wondering from a clinical perspective if that sometimes feels like a bit of a quandary, an uncomfortable place to be in.
As far as
Being the evaluator and answering, of course, the question is, can they not this person, but also the background of this person continues to come to the attention of law enforcement, traditional ways of engagement aren't working. What do we do with this person looking at it a clinical sense versus just the legal sense? I'm wondering if that's somewhat of a quandary for you all as you're looking at it from an ethical point of view, if you wrestle with it at all.
yeah, I think that from an individual perspective, a specific evaluation, it does not change what we are asked to do and what we do. I think that flip side though, all this other stuff is going on. The new federal court order, for example, you can't ignore that that's there. And so when you see somebody who has X, Y, and Z issue going on, and you're aware of what the outcome looks like, they're charged with misdemeanor C offenses, which has a maximum period of 30 days in custody. And you know this going into the evaluation. And you also see them and they're seriously mentally ill. They're not taking medications. You're aware of all the external factors present. I don't feel like it's an ethical or moral issue, I guess. I think that's more of it's something that you're aware of in the process. I know that for me, and I think 99.9% of other evaluators, when we're asked to address a specific legal question, that we're going to do that. But all that stuff is still there and you know about it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like less of a moral, ethical sense in the decision that you make given the evidence that you see in the clinical presentation of that particular case. But I'm wondering the moral injury maybe over time of watching this over and over again and the wear and tear on you as a professional watching this over and over again as part of the process, less than what it would be like on a case. More of a wellness question over time is being part of that system than on a particular case, I guess.
I think that as a whole, that evaluators that work with individuals with serious mental illness, it does take a larger grind than community counseling with individuals with anxiety and depression. We haven't really talked about our practice, but we have multiple people in our practice. And we really encourage, one, taking care of yourself outside of work, and two, essentially consulting with other evaluators, because doing evaluations day in and day out, it's not an easy thing. I know criminal defense attorneys, the turnover rate among them is extremely high. And it's because we're operating in a system that typically has a lot of things occurring that are difficult to address, see, process. I'm not sure I would call it a moral injury, but you have to do more than what you may have to do as a psychologist in other areas, if that makes sense.
No, that totally makes sense. And I'm glad we're having this conversation. I think it's important for us to talk about wellness throughout the system. A lot of focus has been given on certain groups and wellness, and to acknowledge that this is a difficult system to work in for everybody working in this system, not only just the individuals that are involved in it going through the system, but also the professionals that are working within it. And it does take a toll. There is a grind to it that happens.
I don't think that you would talk with any evaluator who's been doing this for any amount of time who would tell you that they haven't been burned out. And I think that is probably higher among people that do this as a primary thing. There's evaluators that do other things where they do evaluations and they do therapy. But when you're day in, day out an evaluator, it'll burn you out, and you have to have a way of how you deal with that. And everybody does it a little bit differently, but you have to be aware of that.
Wellness in this intersection is so important. Speaking of being an evaluator day in, day out, it isn't just evaluations for fitness to proceed. We talk about those a lot in Oregon, but it's not just competency or GEI evaluations. Y'all do a lot of other things. You and I had a conversation where I was mostly focused on GEI and fitness to proceed and was pretty unaware of the other pieces of your work. So I'm wondering if you want to talk about that a little bit. What other pieces of work do you do within this intersection?
We do a lot of different types of evaluations. There's fitness to proceed GEI, like you mentioned. There's other types of what we call mental state evaluations at the time of the allegations, diminished capacity and intent evaluations, extreme emotional disturbance evaluations related to murder cases. Those are what we call statutory evaluations. They're clearly spelled out in the statutes as far as what those are to include and how you address those issues. There's other competency, like whether somebody was competent to waive their Miranda rights at the time. A large part of our work is sentencing evaluations related to both mitigating and aggravating factors. Typically, the defense attorney is looking for mitigating factors present in the case. The state is looking for aggravating factors present and whether they can be classified as an extremely dangerous offender. We do a lot of risk assessments related to multiple different areas, so whether that's violence, sexual offending, stalking, fire setting, and then how you intervene, because a big part of risk assessments isn't just saying whether somebody's a certain risk level. It's more about what kind of services and priorities do they need from both a treatment and supervision perspective. We get asked to do a fair amount of mental health court evaluations. Every mental health court around the state has different criteria written out as far as what qualifies for mental health court or how they assess that and what they need, whether they want a specific recommendation related to that. A lot of times attorneys just need to know what's going on with the specific individual and the individual's dynamics. So a lot of times that's used down the line for sentencing mitigation, but sometimes the attorney just needs to get an underlying understanding of their client's mental health because that may impact how things proceed in a non-fitness to proceed area. We have some evaluators in our practice that do juvenile dependency evaluations. So talking about parental capacity with individuals involved with DHS. That's a civil evaluation. It's not criminal court. And then neuropsychological evaluations, fitness for duty evaluations as well. So a lot of different types of evaluations.
Yes, and it sounds like not only requiring great clinical expertise, but also great legal expertise for each type of evaluation that you're doing.
Whether it's through the court asking or a retaining party, there needs to be an understanding of both the legal aspects and as well as what the referral question is. With court orders, for example, that's spelled out very clearly. When you're hired by a specific party, that's typically relying to an extent on what they're asking to be addressed. But multiple different areas of Oregon laws that have to be addressed.
I'm glad we're talking about this because even in the short conversation you and I had, there's so many more aspects of it I wasn't aware of because most of the conversation with certified forensic evaluators is generally around GEI and fitness to proceed. So I'm really glad that we took the time to talk about the diversity of evaluations that you do within your corporation and the need for the clinical and legal expertise for each of them, I think really doesn't get talked about very much when talking about certified forensic evaluators.
I tell you personally, I don't do all of those different types of evaluations that I just referenced. Psychologists as a whole, we're trained as generalists, and then down the line, you focus your areas, but it's very hard to be able to do everything.
I was wondering if you did them all because I was wondering when you had time to sleep.
I do not do all of those. Being in a group, all the bases are covered with different people, but I don't think there's anybody in our practice that does all of them.
Yeah, I can imagine because that's quite a list and quite a lot of expertise. I'm curious, I know that certified forensic evaluators do a lot of work with courts and judges and also attorneys on both sides, defense and prosecution. I'm wondering if there is something you wish that either folks in the court process or policymakers knew about certified forensic evaluators that people don't know about or don't readily know about.
I think that people look at sometimes evaluators and assume that we're advocates for a party in a case. And I think that is not correct in the large majority of cases. Going back to the moral injury piece of that we talked about earlier, at the end of the day, we're asked to be independent. And I think that 99.9% of evaluators do their best with that. The term hired gun gets tossed around a lot in our field. And I think that is not accurate.
I think that's a good thing to touch on because that is out there in the atmosphere. So I'm glad that we're talking about it today. There's pretty high professional conduct and ethical considerations with these evaluations, and the folks are doing their best to be independent and give good, sound clinical and legal recommendations, and not necessarily just from a particular point of view. Would that be a fair way to put it?
Yeah, the misconception that it's easy to underestimate the amount of complexity that a lot of these evaluations take, especially with the fitness to proceed. I think that a lot of times people look at these cases and are like, why do you need an evaluator? And there are cases like that where you do not need an evaluation done because it's very clear one way or another. But the idea that you can have somebody with no education and no experience in mental health making these calls, I don't feel is accurate as well.
I think of the complexity of presentation and how our policies and statutes a lot of the times assumes that people exist in silos, that you have a psychiatric disorder, or you have an intellectual and developmental diagnosis, or you have a substance use disorder, or you have a personality disorder, and that they are mutually exclusive categories that do not meet, which don't actually exist in real life. So there's a lot of complexity within a human being, and there could be underlying pieces going on that would be difficult to suss out if you don't have a lot of background in all of that complexity and how to get to what is driving the bus, so to speak, regarding the question on competency or GEI.
And even if you do have a lot of experience, there are cases that you will see, no matter how much experience, where you don't have an answer, right? I think that a lot of times as evaluators, we're pressed to have an answer because we are supposed to have an answer or some type of recommendation, whether that's a conclusive answer or not. We're asked to provide a determination, but there are those cases where we don't have an unequivocal answer. And being able to recognize that, and especially like you said, a lot of those things overlap, like methamphetamine use and psychosis. There's times where you don't have an answer. You can kind of weigh the probabilities of things, but is it methamphetamines? Is it what we call a primary psychotic disorder? Is it a combination of both? A lot of times we don't know. And so being able to say that you don't know is okay at times as well.
And important. I think really, really important and underrated. Being able to say there's lots of possibilities with my expertise, my understanding, and my evaluation. This is my best understanding of what is going on, but I cannot emphatically tell you that this is absolutely the case. And being able to say that.
Yeah, it's not just from a clinical perspective either, because there's the clinical aspect of it. What is, if any, the qualifying mental disorder? And there's ambiguity in that. There are many cases where two well-trained, knowledgeable, good evaluators disagree about a specific diagnosis or what's driving the bus. And neither is necessarily right or wrong. Then there's also the back end where we're asked to answer specific psycholegal questions. And there are plenty of times where we don't know as evaluators. And in those cases, here's all the information. We don't have an answer, but the court gets to make an answer, which when you start working in these systems more and more, some courts really don't like. But I think that as an evaluator, you have to acknowledge when you don't know.
I can imagine. There is a pressure and a belief that you will evaluate and suss out the capital T truth of what is going on. It seems like sometimes in listening to folks in conversations throughout the state that there is a belief that all evaluators should be able to find the truth. And that's what makes good evaluations, is that everybody agrees on the truth. And I'm wondering if the reality is that it's much more nuanced. Sometimes there isn't a capital T truth. There's different perspectives of looking at it. And the benefit of being able to say there's different hypotheses and I don't know, having that nuance, and more people make that decision together, like through the court making that decision, than just relying on someone to seek out a capital T truth that may or may not exist.
I think that especially with the retrospective of an evaluator, we get all these sources of data, whether that's a defendant's perspective on it, police reports, reports from family, mental health records, and we're asked to weigh all these different things. But at the end of the day, we weigh those things. But the idea that there's one absolute truth that it comes to, in retrospect, it's often difficult to find that. And so it's laying out the different hypotheses. And I don't think any evaluator can say 100% this is what happened. I think it's with a degree of confidence in that and acknowledging when you don't have confidence in that.
This conversation makes me think of the policy conversation around shortened evaluations, right? Quick evaluations, as far as not quick as in timing, but the idea that there shouldn't be as much information in the evaluations. And I always think about this during these conversations, thinking about how complex these questions are, the complexity of the person in front of you, and how while you're trying to balance making the evaluations doable, right? So they get done on a quicker time scale, but also having enough information for evaluators to be able to make nuanced recommendations, for a court to be able to have enough information where they can make a decision based upon that nuance. It makes me wonder about this whole idea of length and content evaluations, and the idea that I hear from time to time, well, they really need to be short and specific to this one piece versus a more complex and nuanced evaluation. And I'm wondering what you think about that.
There's always a balancing act. Reports is a great example. You meet with somebody, you have legal documents, you have mental health records. And if you take the combination of all of those things, you can write a 1,000-page report to the court. If you include every single word from the records, it's always trying to include what's relevant. That's part of our guidelines as forensic evaluators. Is you only include relevant information. Oregon is somewhat unique in this perspective. There are other states where you see fitness to proceed evaluations that are a paragraph. I think that there's an investment though on both sides, where a lot of times, especially with higher level felony cases, for example, there is a vested interest on the state side. I think from the defense side, there's a vested interest. When somebody's found unfit to proceed, a lot of things occur on the back end that can affect a defendant's life far into the future, whether that's them being unable to access firearms, all of these different things that can impact our evaluations, and the subsequent findings that come from them have real world implications. Whichever way you cut it, whichever perspective you take on it, they have real world outcomes. I think that boiling it down to checklists, for example, oversimplifies it and doesn't give it the due diligence that it should have.
It makes me think back to before there was a certified forensic evaluator process and certification, and the problems that resulted, what ended up happening through the GEI system, where because those folks did not have the education and training that they needed in order to make those determinations, later on, charges were dismissed and they were no longer followed. And so it makes me think of the need for professionals where this is their bailiwick and their specialization, the need for them to be able to speak to that nuance and the different hypotheses and have that available for the court versus a quick down and dirty checklist where you may have either a lot of false positives or a lot of false negatives.
Yeah, and there's the potential for that to occur on multiple different stages. I think that the severity of the potential adverse outcome ranges on that, but there's still an adverse outcome. And I think that at some point there has to be a consideration of what is an appropriate risk tolerance in that perspective.
Right, because even if you're thinking about hospitalization, that does still have long-term consequences. I just did my TSA pre-check. I re-upped it a month or two ago. I'll tell you what, it's fantastic when you travel a lot. It is glorious and I love it. I redid it and I noticed, and I don't think this is new, I think it's just because we're doing so much around civil work and the work we do in the forensic realm. There are questions if you were ever involuntarily hospitalized and lots of psychiatric questions on the TSA pre-check. And I was really surprised to see that there. I think sometimes we don't think about the consequences that can happen for folks in their lives. We get really, really focused on the process right now, and we don't think about the ripples that could happen with folks later on.
Yeah, there are real world implications for a defendant. And then there's also real world implications for the state in a lot of cases. They're victims of crimes that the state is to serve. That has real world implications as well to people's lives.
Absolutely. There are real world implications and ripples in multiple pieces in this process. In my opinion, being able to have a nuanced and well thought out evaluation, I think, is really important. One, for certified forensic evaluators to be able to make the best hypotheses and recommendations, and for the court to be able to make a decision based upon the best available information.
The general public has a vested interest in this as well, because I'm not sure what the average cost is per day at the state hospital, but I know it's over $1,000 a day.
The last I heard, it was $1,300 a day. Yeah.
$1,300, right?
That was the last I heard. Yeah.
People may shrug their shoulders and say, oh, it's a misdemeanor B. It's 6 months. But at the end of the day, that is what? $200,000 at 6 months?
That's a lot of money. I am not a math whiz. We've established this on the podcast before. I'm not a math whiz, but that is a lot of money.
That was just off the top of the head number. I don't know the exact number, but somebody's paying that.
We're all paying
and
that.
that doesn't Yeah, and that doesn't even account for the cost of the court. That doesn't account for the cost of attorneys. That doesn't account for the cost of the community mental health individuals that are involved in the process once that starts. It doesn't account for the cost of the evaluation. Once this process is initiated, typically there's a significant cost on everybody.
Going the forensic route in order for someone's treatment needs to be met is a very expensive prospect.
Yeah, I know that there's a common complaint of how much mental health care costs in general. And when it gets involved in the forensic realm, you multiply that by 10. So there are implications across the spectrum.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm wondering, in the time we have left, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you want to make sure that we touch on, Andrew?
When we're talking about what do people in our field actually do, there's a lot of different things outside of just evaluations that we do. So I know that all psychologists do training as part of graduate school and internship and postdoc. I think that a lot of evaluators do that on the back end as well. So involved in training practicum students, interns, especially at a state hospital, and then postdocs. And then I know some evaluators do consulting work. In our practice, we do consulting work. And then there's also training that we do around these issues to different parties. Super easy to focus on. Evaluators do fitness to proceed evaluations. It's typically a lot more than that.
Absolutely. What kind of trainings does your group do?
So the most recent one was broad training on fitness to proceed evaluations and how evaluators do that, a little bit more in depth on common issues that evaluators see in fitness to proceed evaluations was the most recent one. We've done trainings on the different types of evaluations. We've given trainings to attorneys' offices about when to request an independent evaluation. So it's typically on the intersection of mental health and the law in Oregon. A lot of what we talked about today, but more about specific issues. It's more focused opposed to the broader discussion that we've been having about statewide process. We get asked by attorneys or parties like mental health providers to talk about a specific thing.
I think it's helpful to get out there that you all are available to talk about these issues more in depth and specific to what particular subject matter expert might be contacting you. So I'm glad you touched on that because I'm not sure that folks know that. So I'm glad that we're talking about that today.
Typically, the trainings that we have done have been very specific. For example, we've talked about community restoration before, which because over the past 10 years, that's become a thing that community mental health organizations are now tasked to do.
So for our listening audience, earlier we were talking about fitness to proceed and competency. So the question is, okay, this person has not found to be currently competent to stand trial. And it used to be that that person always went to the Oregon State Hospital to get treatment and services to restore competency. And there's lots of issues with that. One, it's really expensive. We talked about it was like right now around $1,300 a day. And two, that person's moved out of their community. They lose all their stuff. They lose their Medicaid enrollment. It's problematic to have the state hospital as the only solution. So there's been the move towards restoration in the community in order for someone to stay in their community, get the treatment, keep their Medicaid benefits. And there's a lot of issues that go along with that are longer than what we have left in this podcast. That is called competency restoration, and now it's occurring in more places than just at the hospitals, also happening in the community and within the continuum of care. There's lots of issues and complications that go along with that, but just wanted to give folks an idea of what you were talking about.
When individuals are in the community for competency restoration, I think a lot of people think of competency restoration like I'll teach people what a judge does and that we've checked the box of they're competent to stand trial. If you read evaluations, that's typically not the issue. And then what invariably happens is that defendants stay in community restoration for years because what's being delivered isn't matching the needs. And then you have an evaluator coming in, whoever that evaluator is, saying these issues are still present. They've been present for years, and it's just like disconnect. And tell me if I'm wrong here, but I'm not sure that there's been a statewide initiative of here's what you do with competency restoration services.
I think it's gotten clearer over the years, but I can tell you, especially at the beginning, there was a lot of focus on legal skills training. So as Andrew was talking about, what the judge does. So if someone is presenting, and we're going to go for a fairly simple presentation on this example. If someone is presenting with acute psychotic symptomology, telling them who the judge is, not super helpful in that regard. Because when they're psychologically stable, they may know who the judge is and what they do in the court process and everything else. The thing that isn't holding them up is knowing what the judge does.
The thing that is holding them up is the acute symptomology that they're experiencing. But a lot of the times when folks think of competency restoration, they go quickly to this legal side of it and legal skills training, when what may be more helpful is dealing with social determinants of health that may be impacting someone's stability, and also helping stabilize symptomology may be much more helpful than legal skills training, although lots of folks focus on legal skills training. It's not an either or question. Some cases it might be, but for lots of folks, it's about stabilizing someone psychiatrically and within their living situation, and not just about what the judge does. And there's a lot of issues going along with that in funding and reaching people and getting people into housing and having places for people to go that really complicate that picture, I guess, is the best way for me to answer that.
Yeah, it's a complicated process, right? By definition, the statute says that it has to be symptoms of a qualifying mental disorder impairing somebody's fitness to proceed. That should be the target. That manifests in different ways. If somebody has an intellectual disability, it may be that they need to be talking to the judges. And you may not be quote unquote treating the intellectual disability. But there's also a lot of external factors that come present when you go in community restoration. If they don't have transportation to get to their restoration appointments or meet with their psychiatric prescriber, that's a problem. If they're continuing to use methamphetamines when they're on community restoration and they have a psychotic disorder, that's typically a problem. It gets really complex. I think that Colorado does a pretty good job of community-based restoration, and there's some other states that do it really well. I think that Oregon is still trying to figure it out and what that looks like. And I think that there's been a big push towards community restoration. I know that since I've been in the state of Oregon, there's been a very strong push towards community restoration, and that we need more funding sources for it, which I don't think anybody disagrees with. We're 5-10 years deep in that conversation, and I'm not sure how much more resources are actually available at this point, which kind of goes on the line of not everybody needs to go to the state hospital, but something needs to happen.
There needs to be options, right? There just can't be the alpha and omega of options. There has to be a continuum.
Right. It cuts both ways as well. There are a lot of parties that are like, nobody should be in the state hospital.
Mm-hmm.
Let's keep them in the community. It's going to be a case-dependent thing. There are certainly people that need acute psychiatric treatment that we see that may not meet the bar for civil commitment in the state of Oregon. What do you do in those situations?
Right. It needs a nuanced, tiered approach with options.
Yeah. Somebody with an intellectual disability that has a wide range of psychosocial family support is going to have different needs than somebody who's in an acute psychotic episode. I know that one of the things that they addressed, I think in the last legislative session, related to placements was there's the determination if you're charged with a Measure 11 felony, the community restoration process can be bypassed, or a determination about that. You can go to the state hospital. There's a vested interest of safety. It's a very complicated process in Oregon. I'm not sure how far we as a state are towards achieving those things.
It is a very complicated and nuanced process, that is for sure. In our time left, I'm wondering if you have any last thoughts for our listeners, Andrew.
I think that Oregon's in a very transitional period. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't remember up until 5 years ago reading about mental health stuff in the newspaper all the time. I feel like there's been an increased focus on this. And maybe that's for a wide variety of reasons, probably. But I think that it's just a very complicated process. And there's a lot of levers at multiple different levels that are moving constantly. As an evaluator, there's multiple different things at all different times that are complicating. I'm not sure that's a great ending point. Great words of wisdom, but
it does make me happy that we're seeing it more often, and that the legislature has been really responsive and thinking about ways to get out more resources to help engage folks in different ways outside of the traditional system and what's traditionally been set up. So that, I think, is going to be really helpful. And yet we also have some issues that we're dealing with, having enough people and having enough placements in the time that it takes. There is a lag that happens that definitely gets felt farther and farther down the line as folks are trying to get things in place, that it isn't an immediate effect that is felt when money goes out, that it takes some time. And we've been in this situation for a really, really long time. This has been building since deinstitutionalization. It's going to take longer than a couple of years for us to address and fully implement solutions. We've been at this for a while. I think we're all feeling that.
Yeah, and I think that if you talk with most evaluators, they can list 10, 15, 20, 50 problems that they see. I'll speak for myself. I can't give you 5, 10, 15, 20, 50 solutions, though.
That's hard.
Yeah, it's very easy to point out all the things that are going wrong. it's much harder to find the solutions to them. And there's people much smarter than me that are involved in the process, and I don't think they've figured out the solutions at this point. So
I love to quote Judge Jones. He told me this when I first started working on the fitness issue a number of years ago. He looked at me and said, there's a lot of smart people that have been working on this for a long time, and they didn't figure it out. So it's going to take a lot of smart people in the future working on this to figure it out. That was really helpful for me as I was starting the part of my career really looking at competency restoration and fitness to proceed, that it's going to take all of us working together to figure it out, that there's probably not just one of us that is going to have that answer on our own.
yeah, it's going to require a lot of repeated hiccups over time. And again, it's not just Oregon. I think that in Oregon, it's very easy to kind of take this narrow view. These are the problems that I am seeing. But these are issues that are going on across the country. It's not just Oregon. I mean, I'm not sure if that's more comforting or less comforting. That's going on everywhere that nobody's been able to fix it yet.
Right. I was just reading an article this week in one of my classes about Ghana and the issues that Ghana is facing around institutionalization and overcrowding, looking at possibilities for deinstitutionalization and dealing with these very same issues that we're dealing with in Oregon around continuums of care and fully funding the system and having different pathways for engagement and not just having one that is supposed to work for everyone. And so this is not just an Oregon issue. This isn't just a United States issue. This is an international issue that we're all kind of wrestling with this, and that it's going to take a while for us to find ways working together to figure it out.
Yeah, it's going to take a while. That's a great positive.
You know me, Andrew, I can't help myself. I have to think that there is a pathway through this and that all of us will figure it out by working together. Because my goodness, if I didn't, I have to think that there's a pathway through. So I can't help myself. You know me.
Yeah, eternal optimist.
That's right. Well, on that, in my internal optimism moment, not only in Oregon, but on an international scale, I'm so glad that you joined me today. Thank you so much, Andrew. It's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
The Center Collaborative is a production of the Oregon Center on Behavioral Health and Justice Integration, a specialized division of Greater Oregon Behavioral Health Incorporated. It is produced by me, Chris Thomas, with production assistance from Patrick Kennedy. Music by Pat Mulvihill and Patrick Kennedy. Subscribe to the Center Perspective using your favorite app. To learn more about criminal justice and behavioral health integration in Oregon, visit the Center's website at ocbhji.org. You can also find us on Facebook. We'd love to hear from you. Please reach out to us. Join us next time as we chat with the experts about programs and partnerships that work within this complex and yet compelling field. Thank you for joining our conversation.